let me ask you something strange. Why can Tibetans breathe where the rest of us choke? On the Tibetan Plateau, 14,000 feet above sea level, the air thins to a point most lungs can't handle. Oxygen levels drop to 60% of what we're used to. For outsiders, even standing still up here feels like drowning slowly. But the locals, they sprint, herd livestock, raise families. They live full lives in air that should kill. For years, no one could explain how. And then came the discovery. Not in the mountains, but far to the north, in a frozen Siberian cave. You see, in 2014, geneticists found something buried deep in Tibetan DNA, a variant of the EPAS1 gene, also called the super athlete gene. This mutation regulates hemoglobin, letting the body absorb oxygen efficiently without overproducing red blood cells, which can be deadly at high altitudes. It was a genetic adaptation, but it wasn't human. This version of EPAS1 couldn't be found in other Asian populations, not even the Han Chinese, who share thousands of years of ancestry with Tibetans. It was almost non-existent in everyone else, until scientists compared it to the genome of a long-extinct species. Inside Denisova Cave in southern Siberia, researchers had sequenced DNA from a single finger bone, left behind by a girl who lived more than 40,000 years ago. She wasn't human. She wasn't Neanderthal. She was something else entirely. Denisovan. And her genetic code? It matched. The Tibetan people had inherited this powerful gene from an ancient, now vanished species, a people who may have conquered high altitudes long before us and left behind the ultimate evolutionary shortcut. Today, up to 88% of Tibetans carry at least one copy of this gene. It's the fastest natural selection event ever documented in human evolution. Think about that. A single gene from an extinct hominin still shapes how people breathe at the top of the world. But here's the real mystery. How did a gene from a forgotten girl in Siberia end up inside the lungs of a herder in Tibet? That's where we left off. And to answer it, we have to go deeper, not just into the DNA, but into the rock, into the cold, breathless stone of a Tibetan cave, where the past still whispers. In 2019, on the remote Tibetan plateau, researchers made a find so unexpected it forced them to rewrite the timeline of human evolution. In a limestone cave called Baishya Karst Cave, perched at 3,280 meters above sea level, they uncovered something no one saw coming. A jawbone fossil, massive, weathered, almost inhuman. It didn't belong to any known modern human species. It was dated to 160,000 years ago. That's 100,000 years before Homo sapiens ever set foot on the plateau. The fossil had no preserved DNA, but scientists turned to a method even older, paleoproteomics, the study of ancient proteins. And the results came back clear. This was Denisovan, confirmed by the specific sequences of collagen inside the bone. Let that sink in. Long before the EPAS1 gene appeared in Tibetan genomes, long before we got here, the Denisovans had already made these deadly heights their home. They weren't tourists, they weren't passing through, they were residents, survivors. In the sediments of that cave, scientists also found stone tools, animal bones with cut marks, even signs of repeated occupation. This wasn't a one-time fluke. Denisovans had lived here, hunted here, breathed the same thin air that only Tibetans breathe easily today, which means that the EPAS1 gene wasn't just a fluke of ancient interbreeding. It was probably developed here by them in real evolutionary time, passed on not just as legacy, but as necessity. And this fossil? It may have come from the very population that gave Tibetans their edge, the bridge between 40,000-year-old Denisovan DNA in Siberia and the living bodies of high-altitude survivors today. But here's what no one expected. The Denisovans weren't the only ones hiding in the genes. Another presence was there, a shadow lineage, ancient, isolated, and until 2025, completely invisible. And then it appeared, not in a fossilized skull, not in a cave wall carving, but in a lab, in lines of code, blinking on a screen in complete disbelief. It happened in 2025 at the Jingyi site in Yunnan, China. Archaeologists had excavated what looked like just another Neolithic skeleton, a 7,100-year-old burial, carefully laid, surrounded by modest artifacts. They called the individual Xingyi _EN routine, until it wasn't. When scientists sequenced its genome, the results were like nothing they'd ever seen. This human wasn't Denisovan, not Neanderthal, not even remotely close to the Homo sapiens lineage that had supposedly dominated Asia by then. This was something else, a genetic anomaly with no known ancestors, a lineage so ancient, so divergent, that it had likely split off more than 40,000 years ago, before modern humans even finished leaving Africa. They called it the basal Asian lineage, and somehow its signals kept echoing in modern Tibetan DNA. Up to 20% of Tibetan ancestry, previously untraceable, a complete mystery, matched the genome of Xingyi En, which means that alongside Denisovans and later East Asian migrants, a third forgotten population had shaped the bloodlines of the Himalayas. This wasn't just a missing piece of the puzzle. It was a whole corner of the board, a ghost population preserved only in genes. No known artifacts, no skeletal legacy until now. And the implications? They're staggering. It means Tibetans aren't just the product of interbreeding between humans and archaic cousins. They carry DNA from a population that doesn't even show up on our evolutionary map, a people who lived, died, and vanished, without ever being named. No written language, no temples, no history books, just blood. And if one unknown species made it into our genomes, how many others are still missing from the story? Still buried beneath the soil, waiting to be named, or never found at all? That's the haunting question left by Xingyi En, a forgotten lineage whispering through Tibetan blood. But it's not the only whisper, because if you step back and look at the Tibetan genome, you'll see something else. Two stories, two migrations flowing side by side, like twin rivers carving a people into the shape of survival. The first river begins over 40,000 years ago during the peak of the Ice Age. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, likely from northern East Asia or southern Siberia, push into the Tibetan plateau, harsh, frozen, unforgiving. But they adapt, slowly, generation after generation. These weren't farmers. These were foragers, living on wild yak, marmots, mountain herbs. And genetically, they carried the archaic markers we now link to Denisovans, possibly even ghost lineages like Xingyi En. They weren't just tough, they were uniquely tuned for altitude. And then, much later, a second river arrived. Around 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, during the Neolithic expansion, millet farmers from the Yellow River Basin began to move west. They didn't just bring seeds. They brought new tools, domesticated animals, and language, the roots of what would become Sino-Tibetan dialects. They farmed barley, built villages, changed everything. But they didn't replace the high-altitude foragers. Instead, the two groups merged, their genomes fused. The lowland farmers brought innovation. The highland foragers brought adaptation. And from that fusion, the modern Tibetan people were born, carrying within them a dual legacy of survival and transformation. Scientific studies show this blend clearly. One 2020 paper used whole genome sequencing from Tibetan and Sherpa populations, revealing a two-layered ancestry, one deeply rooted in ancient Siberia, the other from Neolithic China. This wasn't a takeover. It was a coalescence, an ancient handshake written in blood. But here's where it gets colder, sharper, stranger, Because while these two rivers met peacefully, they weren't alone. Buried in that genetic sediment is the echo of a third force. Not a farmer, not a forager, but something older, something from the ice, from the north, from the plains where silence rides on horseback. That silence didn't last, because around 2,300 years ago, a different kind of movement began. Not slow like farmers, not rooted like foragers. This was speed, precision, mobility. Nomads, born from the frozen steppes of Central Asia, began riding into the western edges of Tibet. And they didn't come empty-handed. Archaeologists in the Ngari region, at altitudes above 4,000 meters, uncovered Iron Age skeletons. Their DNA carried markers linked not to China, not to India, but to the steppe populations of southern Siberia. Their ancestry echoed that of Scythians and possibly early Turkic tribes. These weren't just visitors. They were warriors, blacksmiths, herders, carrying bronze tools, horse gear, and an entirely new way of life. They rode along trade arteries that would later become part of the Proto-Silk Road, connecting Europe to Asia, empires to mountains. But even this early, you could feel it. The plateau wasn't isolated. It was a crossroads. One skeleton dated to around 1,500 BP, roughly 500 CE, shows this clearly. The genes are undeniably Central Asian. A full genetic profile from the steppe, planted deep in the Himalayan soil. But these nomads didn't just leave their bones. They left their systems. They brought new herding strategies, metalwork techniques, possibly even early saddle technologies that reshaped mountain transport. And like every wave before them, they didn't erase, they blended. Their DNA, their tools, their customs folded quietly into Tibetan identity. It's easy to imagine they were the first to ride down from the cold north, the first to bring foreign genes to the plateau. But the genome tells a colder story. Because beneath even their arrival, beneath the bones and bronze, are signals of something older, fainter, an earlier Siberian pulse that doesn't match the nomads or the farmers or the foragers. So what if the steppe horsemen weren't the first to arrive from the north? What if there was another migration, one so ancient it came before memory itself? Now what if I told you that those early arrivals, the ones no one remembered, may not have been fully human? Not in the way we define it today. In 2016, a groundbreaking genetic model emerged from the lab of Dr. Xu Shuhua in Shanghai. It wasn't just a new discovery. It was a new species puzzle. He called it Sunder, short for Sundadont, Upper Paleolithic Northern Dwellers. A mouthful, yes. But behind that name is a chilling possibility. That Tibet's earliest long-term settlers weren't modern humans at all. They were hybrids. According to the model, this group carried a rare blend of DNA, not just from Homo sapiens, but also Denisovans, Neanderthals, and ancient Siberian hominins. A genetic cocktail forged in isolation, trapped in the highlands through the last glacial maximum when ice ruled the earth. These weren't visitors. These weren't drifters. They lived, generation after generation, above 4,000 meters, with oxygen levels so low it would kill most humans today. And somehow, they adapted. While other early populations vanished or got replaced, the Sunder people stayed. They merged with incoming farmers, traders, and warriors. But they were never wiped out. Instead, their DNA quietly flowed forward, century after century, until it resurfaced in the bodies of modern-day Tibetans. Studies show that many modern Tibetans still carry fragments of archaic traits, inherited not from one known lineage, but from this hybrid population, traits that help control oxygen efficiency, hemoglobin levels, energy metabolism. The very traits that define high-altitude survival. Imagine that. The backbone of Tibetan endurance, may have come from a people science only recently realized existed. They didn't leave cities, they didn't leave scripture. But their legacy? It lives in lungs that still breathe thin air without fear, and in the bloodline of a people who never left the sky. But what if I told you that same sky once looked down on something far less peaceful? Because hidden beneath some of Tibet's most sacred ground, beneath the very soil pilgrims walk barefoot across today, are graves. Not a few, not isolated, but clustered, deep, silent. In 2021, a team of archaeologists excavating near Mount Kailash, a place revered by 4 religions known as the spiritual center of the world, found something no one expected: a mass burial buried beneath centuries of snow and silence. The bones were shattered, burned in places, mixed, and old. Carbon dating placed them at just over 3,000 years ago, right at the dawn of what we now call Proto-Tibetan culture. But it was the DNA that made researchers freeze. These remains weren't from one tribe, or even one ancestry. Inside the same grave, they found genetic markers from steppe nomads, similar to the Scythians, mixed with ancient East Asian hunter-gatherer lineages. And then something stranger. A faint signal, an archaic trace, not yet matched to any known population. What happened here? Was it a battle? A raid? A ritual? Or was this the moment where cultures collided? Not peacefully, not through trade or marriage, but through bloodshed. Historians have long assumed the Tibetan plateau was shaped slowly, that its people formed over time through migration and blending. But these skeletons say otherwise. They say there were clashes, violent moments of cultural fusion, not just through story and song, but through conquest. And among the remains, one burial stood out, one set of bones that didn't fit the pattern. Genetically, they didn't belong to any group identified so far. Not the steppe riders, not the local foragers, not even the ancient hybrids from Sunder. Just one body, standing outside all timelines. But one burial had no match at all. That's where we left off, on a question poised in the cold Tibetan dusk. And then, in 2023, something even more unsettling appeared. Not in a mass grave, but alone, silent, deliberate. Deep in central Tibet, excavators found her, an exceedingly well-preserved skeleton of a woman dating back roughly 2,500 years. Around 500 BCE lay beneath high-altitude skies, where most graves speak of ancestry, of familiar bloodlines woven through centuries. But her DNA refused to speak any recognizable tongue. Even her mitochondrial DNA, that maternal thread passed unchanged through generations, didn't match anything we thought we understood. There were no traces of Siberian riders, no echoes of Han ancestry, no whispers of ancient East Asian tribes. Yet when they rebuilt her face, digitally, bone by bone, they saw it. Strong cheekbones, the heavy eyelids of high-altitude dwellers, a nose shaped for breath and survival where there is almost none. Isotope studies confirmed it. She never drank spring water from the plains. She ate the mountain's heart. Yak, barley, they had begun to farm. Her life was written in the soil and snow. Then comes the strangest detail of all. Her burial laid to rest with items and, in a fashion, more fitting of lowland customs. A posture, perhaps a cloth design, a simple cup carved in a style unknown this high but common elsewhere. A silent question. Cultural exchange? Or something darker? Abduction? Adoption? This single woman, genetically everything we can't place, physically everything this air breathes, was either invited into the culture or forced into it. She looked at home in the sky, but belonged to no known tribe. If she came from nowhere, who else walked these heights unseen? Now another vision emerges. Beneath the silent vanity of Western Tibet, the earth hides something more than geometry. In 2024, Archaeologists scanning satellite data noticed faint outlines, patterns hidden under glacial debris. Not random, not natural. Straight lines, unlikely curves, shapes hinting at streets and enclosures. Structures beneath ice, ancient and haunting. These formations speak not of Bronze Age villages, but of something at least 2,000 years older, a pre-agricultural cultural signature. The Earth holds remnants of planning, not life, architecture, not accident. Geological teams drilled below the glacier and found sediment collapsed by earthquakes. Surrounding layers suggest a sudden burial, structures crushed and buried, frozen in time by land shuffling and ice creep. There's no pottery shard yet, no beams, no broken arrowheads. But the geometry refuses to lie. Shapes too deliberate to be left to chance. It points to a civilization, one that rose before diet shifts, before Oriental wheats arrived, before early Tibetan culture even began forming. Could ancestors of Zhangzhung, circa 500 BCE, have inherited an older lineage, one whose cities vanished under ice and seismic fury? If the people of Tibet once built cities we've never seen, what stories vanished with them? What fingerprints were erased by stone and frost, never written down, never spoken? But what if some were never meant to be spoken? Because today, when Tibetans speak, something strange happens. The language flowing from their mouths doesn't match the DNA in their bones. Let me explain. The Tibetan language belongs to the Sino-Tibetan family, tracing back to Neolithic millet farmers from the Yellow River Basin around 6,000 years ago. Their speech spread like their crops, westward, upward, eventually reaching the plateau. But when linguists began dissecting Tibetan, something didn't sit right. Its surface grammar fits the Sino-Tibetan mold, but its core vocabulary? It tells a much older story. Words tied to land, sky, family. They echo pre-Sino phonemes, fragments of lost languages. Language that predates the Yellow River expansion, a linguistic substratum buried like a fossil under every syllable. In 2021, a comparative study showed tonal patterns in Tibetan speech that don't align with Han dialects, but rather with archaic Rougyalrongic languages, long extinct, once spoken in mountain valleys further west. It's as if Tibetans didn't just adopt a new language, they merged with it, twisting it around ancient rhythms, mountain sounds, high-altitude breath. Linguists like Nicholas Tournadre suggest that Tibetan didn't just descend from farmers. It was shaped in the mouths of altitude-adapted foragers whose languages are now gone from the surface of history, but alive in tone, in rhythm, in breath. So here's the paradox. Tibetans speak a language that isn't fully theirs, and yet it couldn't belong to anyone else. But what if the oldest Tibetan language was never spoken aloud? Every breath a Tibetan takes may be carrying the memory of extinct ancestors. High above 4,000 meters, every inhale is a quiet defiance of death. And within that breath is the echo of Denisovans, Sundar, basal Asian lineages, ancient strands of humanity woven into the very physiology of Tibetans. Genetic studies show this most clearly. The EPAS1 gene, known as the super athlete gene, was inherited from Denisovans and has rapidly reached over 75% frequency in modern Tibetans, a sweep that unfolded in less than 3,000 years. Alongside EPAS1, genes like EGLN1 fine-tune red blood cell production, avoiding altitude sickness. But those are not the only ancient signatures beneath our skin. The Sundar lineage, a hybrid group of archaic and modern DNA, and the basal Asian lineages from the Xingyi skeleton, all pass down traits that quiet the mountain's ache, even as the world forgets their names. Today, when Tibetans race across passes, siblings in the wind grazing their skies, their bodies speak of survival, a survival granted by ancestors they never met. In remote valleys, elders whisper stories of resilience, not in words, but in ceremonies, in the rhythm of prayer flags snapping against the cold air. Festivals like the Mount Komalangma Cultural Tourism Festival, held near Everest, drum the heartbeat of ancient identity alongside modern tourism. Traditional weaving, braiding the 108 strands for sacred volumes, has evolved, yet remains tethered to lineage, to forgotten bloodlines and memory. These are not just cultural acts, they are embodied memory, ancestors speaking through yarn, rhythm, breath. In every Tibetan child born in this oxygen-thin cradle, there lives a reckoning between the ancient and the new, between genes that predate glaciers and a world that moves too fast to notice. Tibetan blood remembers things the world forgot. And this isn't the last secret the Himalayas are hiding.